The wording used when being cautioned by police may differ from country to country, but in Scotland in 1980, the caution to be read out was, "I'm going to ask you some questions. I must warn you that any answers you give will be noted and may be given in evidence. You're not obliged to answer these questions. Do you understand?" Cautions must be accurate and read in full. However, everyone makes mistakes. It's just some mistakes are more detrimental than others. Tuesday, the 5th of February 1980, started off for Thomas and Dorothy Main just like any other weekday. The pair left their second-floor tower block flat at Norfolk Court in the Gorbals in Glasgow at 7:15 a.m, and Thomas first drove his wife Dorothy to her job as a cleaner at a working men's hostel before driving to his own job as a hostel superintendent, which was located at the back of the city mortuary. The couple also had a 13-year-old daughter who needed to be woken up each morning for school, and so at 8 a.m. each morning, Dorothy Main would leave her employment and walk the short distance to the nearby phone box and phone the flat to waken Tracy up. If Tracy was already up and about, she would answer the phone and have a chat with her mum, but more often than not, Dorothy just rang the phone a number of times, knowing it would waken Tracy up, before then heading quickly back to the working men's club to continue working. And so at 8 a.m. on Tuesday the 5th of February, Dorothy once again made her way to the nearby phone box and called her flat, not thinking anything of it when Tracy didn't answer the phone. And so Dorothy hung up and continued her day, not realising then just how different her day would end to normal, as back at the Mains flat at Norfolk Court, Tracy would not be waking up again. Usually 13-year-old Tracy Main would hear the phone ringing at 8 a.m. prompt, and reluctantly would get out of bed and ready for school, knowing that her friend would be knocking on her door half an hour later, so the pair could walk the 26 minutes to school across the river in Bridgeton. However, 8:30 came and Tracy's friend knocked as usual at Tracy's flat door, but Tracy didn't answer. Her friend, according to the Glasgow crime fighter, the Les Brown storybook, did hear a bump coming from inside, and so she knocked again and waited. But again, Tracy did not answer, and all was now quiet from inside the flat. Disappointed that she would have to walk to school alone, Tracy's friend slowly made her way down the communal stairs, all the while hoping Tracy would come running after her, but she didn't. Thomas and Dorothy Main both finished work about 4 p.m, and Thomas would usually pick his wife and one of his wife's colleagues up. He then would drop his wife off at their flat first, before taking her colleague home, before then returning to their flat. And so again, just like any other day, on the 4th of February, Thomas dropped his wife off at their flat in the Gorbals, told her he wouldn't be too long, and drove off. Dorothy then made her way up the stairs to their flat, all the while thinking what chores she still had to do before she could sit down and finally relax. Dorothy reached their front door and inserted her key, but before she could turn the key in the lock to unlock the door opened slightly. Alarmed and suspecting perhaps they had been or were being burgled, Dorothy retreated and went to her next-door neighbour, Miss Lewis, and asked if she would investigate with her, to which Miss Lewis agreed. The pair slowly opened the flat door, which showed no signs of forced entry, and entered. The pair walked along the hallway checking rooms as they passed, before coming to the living room and being faced by a horrific sight, with both women then running screaming from the flat, terrified. According to the book Glasgow crime fighter The Les Brown Story, 13-year-old Tracy Main was lying partly on the settee and partly on the floor. She was wearing a parka jacket with its zip partially opened, and her trousers and underwear had been pulled down to her knees, and dried blood was visible on the clothing she was wearing under her undone parka jacket, from the various stab wounds in the area of her heart, with the dried blood indicating that Tracy had been murdered some time much earlier in the day. A post-mortem showed that Tracy had been seized by the throat, that a hand had been placed over Tracy's mouth, and that she had been stabbed 7 times in the area of her heart. But despite her trousers and knickers being found at her knees, there was no evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. According to Glasgow crime fighter The Les Brown Story, from the post-mortem it was revealed that Tracy's wounds had been inflicted by a 10-inch long by an inch wide kitchen knife that was missing from the Mains' home. This weapon was never found. The police were called and a murder investigation was quickly underway, with the inquiry being led by Detective Chief Inspector Les Brown, who ordered that all residents in the block of flats the Main family lived in, as well as Tracy's school friends, be interviewed to try and glean any information as to who Tracy's killer had been. And it would appear that Tracy's murder would be solved quickly, as it was reported in the newspapers the following day that a 35-year-old man had been arrested and taken to the police station for further questioning. However, 12 days later, it was then reported in newspapers that a different man, a 43-year-old, had been arrested and charged with 13-year-old Tracy Main's murder. So who were these men, and had either of them been Tracy's killer? The police's first port of call was to speak to Tracy's school friends, one of which was a 15-year-old girl who'd hung around with Tracy regularly, and this is where detectives had their first lead, as she reported to the police that weeks earlier she and Tracy had been approached by a man who had offered to pay them to have sex with him. But not only that, Tracy's school friend reported that this has happened the previous year too, on several different occasions, where the same man had stopped his car near the park the girls were walking through and offered to pay them to go with him and have sex. Both girls continued to refuse, but were disturbed by this man, and so Tracy's friend took down this man's car registration number. And so, upon being spoken to by the police and asked if she could think of anyone that would want to harm Tracy, Tracy's friend told the police about this, as well as handing over the man's car registration number. Detectives quickly found out that the car belonged to 35-year-old George Campbell, and they arrested him the day after Tracy's murder and brought him in for questioning. Tracy's friend further aided the police by picking this man out of an identity parade. However, following this man being questioned and investigated, he only ended up being charged with making indecent suggestions to Tracy and her friend, as well as to a 14-year-old boy. He was released and awaited trial, and so the hunt for Tracy's murderer continued, but it wouldn't be long before another arrest was made. While some police officers were interviewing Tracy's school friends and arresting George Campbell, other officers were speaking to the Main family's neighbours in the tower block, and they were quickly made aware of 43-year-old Thomas Docherty, nicknamed the Creeper, who, according to an article in the Glasgow Times, had moved into the tower block 6 weeks earlier to a flat on the same second-floor landing as the Mains, with his common-law wife, Mrs. Turner, who was a 73-year-old grandmother. Thomas Docherty was unemployed and had the mental age of an 8-year-old. Following this information coming to light, Thomas Docherty was brought in for questioning before being arrested and subsequently charged with 13-year-old Tracy Main's murder. But surely he hadn't been arrested for Tracy's murder simply because he was called the Creeper and had been known for his sly and strange behaviour, according to other neighbours. No, he wasn't, but I'll get to that. In the days between George Campbell being ruled out of Tracy's murder and Thomas Docherty being arrested and charged with her murder, Tracy's dad, Thomas Main, made an emotional appeal for anyone who had any information that could lead to Tracy's killer to please come forward. Tracy's dad, Thomas, went on to say that since his wife Dorothy had found their daughter, their only child, murdered in their flat, they had been unable to live there, would never be able to live there again, before pleading again for anyone with any information to come forward. Interestingly, at the same appeal, Detective Chief Inspector Les Brown revealed, according to an article in The Scotsman on the 8th of February 1980, that a vitally important lead had been given to them anonymously via a telephone call, where the caller had hung up before any further information could be obtained, and DCI Brown was appealing for this person to make contact once again. DCI Brown obviously would not reveal the exact nature of the information at the time, and I could find no other information about this, so I'm not sure if that person ever did get back in touch with the police. While detectives continued to carry out inquiries, wait for this person to call back with more information, further investigate 35-year-old George Campbell after being questioned, and 43-year-old Thomas Docherty being arrested, Tracy Main's funeral took place at a nearby church where around 1,500 mourners attended, including some of Tracy's teachers and 30 of her fellow pupils. With so many in attendance, not all were able to get into the church. Detectives also attended Tracy's funeral, as well as representatives of Celtic Football Club, as Tracy was a huge Celtic fan, and was described as being a funny, popular girl who played football with the boys around the streets where she lived. So back to 43-year-old Thomas Docherty, who had been arrested and questioned regarding Tracy's murder, and then charged with her murder 2 days after her funeral. But what led to him being charged? Had forensic evidence been found? Or had a witness come forward? No, nothing like that. It was something that came out of his own mouth when he was being questioned. Thomas Docherty had been interviewed on a number of occasions by detectives. During one interview, he had admitted openly to DCI Les Brown that he had known Tracy, which, as he lived on the same floor as her, wouldn't have been a great admission. However, also during questioning, he actually described to detectives the location and positioning of Tracy's body when she had been found. Now, while this was an interesting admission, DCI Brown had a problem. Firstly, he had to take into account Thomas Docherty's mental age, being that of an 8-year-old. Did he understand what was going on, what he was being interviewed for, and how what he said could be taken? And secondly, did this admission mean that he actually killed Tracy, or was it a case of he had seen Tracy's body through the open flat door before the police had arrived? While DCI Brown mulled this over, his boss, Detective Superintendent Ian Smith, who had also been interviewing Thomas Docherty alongside DCI Brown, excused himself briefly from the interview. And it was at this point that Thomas Docherty said something that had not been released to the general public, a fact which confirmed in DCI Brown's mind that Thomas Docherty was Tracy Maine's murderer. While the media had been informed that Tracy had been stabbed in a frenzied attack, it had never been disclosed how many times Tracy had actually been stabbed. In fact, it was 7 times. And so when Thomas Docherty revealed to DCI Brown during a break in one of many interviews, while Detective Superintendent Ian Smith had briefly left the room, that Tracy had been stabbed 7 times, DCI Brown believed that they had their man. DCI Les Brown called Detective Superintendent Ian Smith back into the room where, before asking Thomas Docherty to repeat what he had told him to Detective Superintendent Smith, he cautioned him before finally charging him with Tracy Maine's murder, believing he now had enough evidence to secure a conviction, despite Thomas Docherty telling both detectives that he had heard the claim Tracy had been stabbed 7 times from a news bulletin. According to Glasgow crime fighter the Les Brown story, during questioning, after being cautioned, Thomas Docherty said other things that led a lot of the detectives working on the case to believe he was Tracy's murderer, such as he had been able to show on an upper half of a human form on a piece of paper where Tracy had been stabbed. He had said he knew the Maines' daily schedule, saying that Mr. and Mrs. Maine left at 7:15 a.m. and returned by 4 p.m. He also apparently mentioned that Tracy had stayed off school the day she was murdered, and that if she had gone to school, she wouldn't have been murdered. Thomas Docherty was also taken back to Tracy's flat and asked to lie where Tracy's body had been found, which he was able to replicate exactly, indicating that he definitely had seen Tracy's body. He also demonstrated on DCI Les Brown how Tracy's killer would have grabbed Tracy and stopped her from screaming, before again pretending to stab DCI Brown in the area Tracy had been stabbed. Thomas also apparently talked about what the man who had killed Tracy, hypothetically, would have done with the knife, saying that he would have first tried to put it down the toilet, but that it wouldn't go, and so he would have ended up throwing it into the Clyde at a particular spot. This particular spot of the Clyde was searched, but no knife was found. However, upon Thomas Docherty's solicitor, Joe Beltrami, who also featured in our episode A Murder, a Shooting Spree and a Royal Pardon, carrying out his first consultation with Thomas Docherty, he was not only convinced of his client's innocence, especially as there was no forensic evidence at all linking him to Tracy's murder, but according to the defender, Tales of the Suspected, written by Joe Beltrami, it was also clear to Joe Beltrami that Thomas Docherty didn't actually realise he had been charged with Tracy's murder, and that it was clear to him that Thomas Docherty could be persuaded to say anything. But Joe Beltrami still felt he needed to explain how Thomas Docherty had known that Tracy had been stabbed 7 times, when this information had not been released publicly. And so Joe Beltrami contacted the BBC and STV News, asking them to release copies of all their coverage about Tracy Maine's murder, so this could be gone through to see if it had been mentioned at all that Tracy had been stabbed 7 times. It wasn't mentioned. However, according to a Glasgow Times article, what was said by one STV news presenter was that Tracy had been stabbed several times. Joe Beltrami began to think that Thomas Docherty, with his mental age of 8, had perhaps misheard the report and thought 7 had been said instead of several. While Joe Beltrami believed a jury would agree with this and clear his client, he was also concerned that due to the media reporting of Tracy's murder and the pressure that had been put on to catch Tracy's killer, the jury might feel pressured to find his client guilty without solid evidence. And so, as Joe Beltrami had a good, if not sometimes fraught, relationship with DCI Les Brown, he spoke to him and explained his theory around the several and 7 mistake, as well as made it clear that he did not believe Thomas Docherty had killed Tracy Mayne. However, DCI Brown was having none of it. He was convinced Thomas Docherty was Tracy Mayne's murderer. Before a trial date could be set, though, Thomas Docherty had to be examined by 2 psychiatrists to determine if he was fit to stand trial. And despite Joe Beltrami's concerns, both psychiatrists deemed that he was fit to stand trial, and so a trial date was set, and the defence team began the task of preparing for a tough fight to clear their client. It wouldn't be until the day before the trial that a shocking discovery was made by the defence team that, if disclosed, could see the trial be called off and Thomas Docherty walk free on a technicality. However, did they want their client to walk free on a technicality, with everyone always wondering if he had in fact killed Tracy, or should they not disclose the information they had found, allowing the trial to go ahead in the hope that the jury found Thomas Docherty innocent? Well, they decided that the trial had to go ahead, and the shocking evidence was to be revealed during it. And so, on the 2nd of June 1980, Tracy's distraught friends and family made their way to the High Court in Glasgow, where they prepared themselves to have to sit through the graphic details of Tracy's murder, all the while hoping and praying that at the end of the trial, their beloved Tracy would receive justice when her killer was found guilty. Before the trial began, Thomas Docherty's charge was read out, which, according to the Scotsman on the 18th of February 1980, alleged that he had assaulted Tracy on the 5th of February in her home and seized her by the throat and face and struck her on the body with a knife and murdered her. The first day of the trial consisted mainly of forensic and medical evidence. Medical evidence I've mentioned already, and there wasn't any forensic evidence that directly linked Thomas Docherty to Tracy's murder, so I'm not going to go into those details. Day 2 began with the prosecution telling the jury just why Thomas Docherty had been charged with Tracy's murder, because he said she had been stabbed 7 times, when this information had never been released to the public. The jury and those in the public gallery, including Tracy's family and friends, then spent half the day, according to the Scotsman, on the 4th of June 1980, being shown television film of the murder hunt and transcripts of all TV, radio and press accounts of the search for Tracy's killer, with it being established at the end of this that at no point had it been mentioned that Tracy had received 7 fatal stab wounds in the chest. After lunch, Detective Chief Inspector Les Brown took to the stand to give evidence on how he had obtained this vital piece of information from Thomas Docherty. DCI Brown started by saying Thomas Docherty had been brought in for questioning after being drawn to detectives' attention by other residents of Tracy's block of flats. He told that he and his boss, Detective Superintendent Ian Smith, had been interviewing Thomas Docherty when his boss left the room for a minute, and that it was at this point, when DCI Brown had again asked Thomas Docherty if he had heard about the murder, that he had replied that he had seen it on television, and that he had heard the announcer say that she had been stabbed 7 times, a fact that has now been proven never happened. DCI Brown said he then shouted for Detective Superintendent Smith to come back into the room, at which point he cautioned Thomas Docherty, and it was at this point that the defence, Mr. Hugh Morton QC, got to his feet and objected, and thereafter a 2-hour debate took place about the wording of the caution once the jury had been asked to leave the courtroom. The defence team's shocking discovery the day before the trial began had been that DCI Les Brown, the officer in charge of the investigation, had not written down in his notebook that Thomas Docherty was entitled to stay silent when he cautioned him. DCI Les Brown argued, according to the Scotsman on the 4th of June 1980, that this part of the caution was sometimes given parrot-wise, and that was probably why he had not written it in his notebook. But on his recollection, he was absolutely sure he had advised Thomas Docherty of his right to remain silent. Well, DCI Brown's boss, Detective Superintendent Ian Smith, was there in the room too at the time of the caution. He would have surely picked it up if DCI Brown had failed to mention this vital part of the caution, and as DCI Brown had said, he definitely recalled saying this to Thomas Docherty, and so this would likely have been written correctly in his boss's notebook. And so Detective Superintendent Ian Smith was called to the stand, where he said that he had written down the exact caution given to Thomas Docherty by DCI Brown. Great. No, not great, because Detective Superintendent Smith had also omitted to write down the fact that Thomas Docherty had the right to remain silent. He said he had written down exactly what DCI Brown had said, which according to Glasgow crime fighter The Les Brown Story was, Thomas, it is my duty to inform you that in connection with the murder of Tracy Main on the 5th of the 2nd, 1980, and in an effort to establish the identity of the person responsible, I'm going to ask you some questions. I must warn you that any answers you give will be noted and may be given in evidence. Do you understand? To which Thomas Docherty said, yes. So it would appear that DCI Brown did omit this vital part of the caution. Back in the 1980s, interviews weren't recorded, so we can only go with what was written in both notebooks. So what now? Well, the jury were called back in, and Lord Cowie, the judge presiding over the trial, said, according to an article in the Scotsman on the 4th of June 1980, that it is with regret I have to say that Detective Chief Inspector Brown is wrong in saying he administered the full and normal caution to the accused on this occasion. I would be slow to criticise senior officers on matters of this sort, particularly when something is done in the course of a difficult, protracted and serious police inquiry. But unfortunately, I had the benefit of the evidence of Superintendent Smith, who was present at the time of the caution, and he confirmed that the caution was administered in the terms written in Mr. Brown's notebook. Lord Cowie then ruled that anything Thomas Docherty had said after he had been cautioned was inadmissible, at which point the prosecution withdrew the charge. Gasps, sobs, and angry shouts from the public benches were then heard when Lord Cowie directed that the jury find Thomas Docherty not guilty. He continued by saying, whatever one might think about this, it is absolutely essential that justice must be done and be seen to be done. Tracy's dad, Thomas, spoke to reporters outside of the court and said, according to the Scotsman on the 4th of June, I'm shocked and disappointed. What more can I say? Although he did say the following day in the Scotsman newspaper that he did not blame the police for the outcome of the trial, but that he was extremely upset that a legal technicality had brought the trial to an end. Thomas Main even called into the police station and offered DCI Les Brown and other detectives his support after the trial collapsed. However, before this, on the day of the collapsed trial, as the anger grew in and out of the High Court in Glasgow at the massive mistake by two top detectives and the subsequent collapse of the trial, DCI Les Brown, in shock himself and being the target of many angry friends and relatives, left the court in a daze. He couldn't believe he had made such a stupid mistake, but he had, so now he had to face it, as well as any repercussions. But first he and Joe Beltrami had to ensure the safety of Thomas Docherty, whose life was now in danger, as a contract had been put out on him. Thomas Docherty was smuggled quietly out the back of the court, while angry friends and relatives gathered at the front, and he was taken to a police station for his own safety, where he stayed for 2 days before he was taken to Carstairs Psychiatric Hospital as a voluntary patient, and he stayed here for a month, before he was moved, according to the Glasgow Times in November 2020, to a social work hostel in a secret location in England, where he remained, never returning to Glasgow. DCI Les Brown was crucified in newspapers, with it being said in the Scotsman on the 5th of June 1980, that the Member of Parliament whose area covered the flats where Tracy was found was profoundly disturbed by the simple mistake made by DCI Brown, and that he would be seeking urgent meetings with the Solicitor General for Scotland and Strathclyde Police's Chief Constable, the then Patrick Hamill. A full investigation was launched by the then Strathclyde Police and Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service into why the caution error had not been noticed a long time before the trial had begun, as well as raising the issue of general police procedures when dealing with people such as Thomas Docherty, who had a subnormal mentality, and what lessons should be learned, with Chief Constable Patrick Hamill saying, "We are studying the matter very carefully and all its possible implications." It was also reported that the elementary police blunder was raised in the House of Commons in England. Despite all this, DCI Brown was happily surprised when he himself had to meet with the Chief Constable, Patrick Hamill, the day after the disastrous trial. As DCI Les Brown stood nervously in front of the Chief Constable, waiting to be berated, instead the Chief Constable only said to the DCI, according to the Les Brown story, "You've made a mistake, which you've admitted. It could have happened to anyone." DCI Les Brown, however, was moved out of the murder investigation team within the week and sent to the Criminal Intelligence Department instead, as he had lost his credibility. With Thomas Docherty now safely in hiding, his solicitor, Joe Beltrami, said in an article in The Scotsman that he was disappointed the trial had not gone the full distance, as he was sure Thomas Docherty would have been acquitted due to the lack of evidence. He advised that at no point did he think that Thomas Docherty had carried out this dreadful murder, and he felt it was unfair that Thomas Docherty was being held responsible for being Tracy's murderer by members of the public. DCI Les Brown went on to kind of back this up by saying in his book that a well-known criminal had told him that, in his opinion, Les had known that Thomas Docherty was innocent, and he had deliberately made the caution error so that Thomas Docherty would be cleared, and that an underworld contact had told DCI Brown that he was certain Thomas Docherty was innocent. Les Brown, who passed away in 2019, said in his book that there is no doubt in his mind that Thomas Docherty saw Tracy's body at some stage, but whether he murdered her or not, he had no idea. There was no forensic evidence to link him to Tracy's murder, and no weapon was ever found. For him, the mystery of who killed Tracy Mayne goes on, but he hoped that the truth would come out one day. All that he is sure of is that Tracy Mayne's case has a legacy of lessons to be learned, even by today's police. In December 2020, a new appeal was made for anyone with information about the murder of 13-year-old Tracy Mayne to come forward. Tracy's murder may have taken place 40 years prior, and it may be a cold case, but it remained an unresolved murder and still remains open, with detectives from the Homicide and Governance Review Team ready to assess and investigate any new information they receive from the public or through developments in forensic science. If you know anything about Tracy's murder, please contact Police Scotland on 101 or Crime Stoppers anonymously on 0800 555 111 if you're in the UK. Before I end today's episode, I'd just like to introduce you to Robbie, who I met at CrimeCon in Glasgow and who is behind the Cold Tapes podcast, which is an innovative, first-of-its-kind audio experience. It's part podcast and part murder mystery game, where you can play detective and be in with a chance of winning £10,000. Let's hear more about it from Robbie. Robbie, it's lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
It was lovely meeting you for the first time at CrimeCon as well. And seeing you there on your new podcast.
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, it was a good event, eh?
It was a brilliant event, aye. So tell us a little bit about Cold Tapes then and where the idea came from.
Okay, so yeah, Cold Tapes is our brand new murder mystery podcast. Hopefully it's the most authentic murder mystery of all time, where you, the listener, can win £10,000 if you solve it. So before I worked at Free Turn, I exec produced a true crime podcast called Hunting Glen with John Sweeney. Do you remember?
I remember that one, yeah.
Yeah, and that was kind of my first foray into podcast production. But before that, I was actually was trying to sell TV game show formats.
Ooh.
So I was kind of immersed in that world of non-scripted TV entertainment.
Did you get any taken up then? Have you had any you would know on the TV?
So I got involved in the development of a few. None of them were sold. One of the, actually, I tell a lie. I was involved in a show called Nine Windows that actually went out in Japan on Nippon TV.
Wow.
So that's a good claim to fame. So it was quite, varied experience in my sort of time before I joined 310, and obviously the explosion of internet sleuthing relating to true crime stories, that kind of sparked a thought for me to combine all of that experience that I'd had. And I had an idea for a podcast that was like fictional, non-linear detective story that anyone could listen to and play along with. That was kind of where it started. And ultimately it's like, yeah, if you played it and solved it, you could win money. That was like broad brushstrokes idea. And when I joined 310, my colleagues there loved that format idea, and they really brought their expertise to the party, because 310, it's a production company, and we mostly make movies and we do work in TV, but it's all drama. And that's not my experience really. So the team really dug into it, developed a story and ran with it. So it's a completely original story. It's a classic closed circuit setup. So what Agatha Christie invented really, that style where a murder takes place in a location with a finite number of suspects. We wanted, that. So the team developed a story, the whodunit, and it's set in Antarctica during the winter months, what scientists refer to as winter over. So ultimately during those winter months, the scientists who stay there are kind of locked there. They can't get out and no one can get in. So there's our closed circuit, right? And a British behavioural scientist called Drew Fairfield has been murdered near his research base. So essentially you've got that research base and the 16 other people who were based there who are now suspects. And you're in the ears of the lead investigator, DCI Tessa McAllister from the Met. And you kind of listen along to her investigation and piece together the clues to figure out who the killer could be, understanding the backstory, understanding what Drew was doing down there, and figuring out with each of those suspects, whether their alibi stacks up, whether they had a motive, and if they had the opportunity to kill Drew. So that's where it came from. That's what Cold Tapes is, yeah.
So they're just mentioning there about who had the motive. The first few episodes are the character building, and you get the baseline interview with Drew and the member of the staff that's there, and it's just really interesting. He's you think it's one thing, and all the while I was thinking, okay, sometimes they get a bit annoyed at Drew if he was asking too many probing questions. But why would anybody have motive to kill? What would the motive be? And then we hit the episode I'm on just now, which is the Andrew Fairfield episode when he does his own. And then the penny drop. So that was a lovely moment. It was just nice and gentle. And then you're like, oh, right, okay, now I get it. What's going on?
And that's brilliant to hear, because that's something that, the team really crafted. It's sequenced in a way that there are those big sort of hooky cliffhanger moments and turns in the story where you're like, oh, I have to know now. You understand what's driving Drew and maybe what led to his murder. So the conceit's really, really smart, right? He's kind of recorded these baseline interviews with all of the people down on the base to understand who they are, the relationships between them all. And he's obviously a provocateur really in that environment, which leads to his demise. And then the investigator, so Tessa, she gets to take all of those files that Drew recorded himself and then obviously starts her own investigation. So you haven't even got to, you'll get to hear next in the sequence Drew's own sort of audio diaries. So you really get to hear sort of his secret recordings too of life on the base and how people are reacting to him leading up until no more Drew.
Yeah.
And then after that, you get the interviews. So Tessa going in remotely over the telephone, speaking to all of these different people who are from all over the world. We made sure that we built these bases anyway, have so many different nationalities on them, studying their various different various different fields. And it's great for audio, right? Because you can distinguish each suspect from another because of their accents, and you might be like, yeah, it could be the Australian girl, or maybe it's one of the guys from Chile. So yeah, it sort of lent itself into the world of podcasting and audio, and we really went hard on that.
It's a good idea because the listener gets to be involved. We all listen to podcasts, and you can comment and think what you thought about the episode and such like. But it's nice to actually you're involved. You get to. It's a really interesting concept. I wanted to ask you. So I know you worked with Lyndon from Consulting Cops to make sure that DCI Tessa, the way she investigated was as accurate as possible. So how did you do that for all the other characters? Because they all had varied professions, didn't they? Very varied professions. And you went into so much detail. How did you work with somebody different for each character?
Well, we worked with two fantastic writers who did their own research as well, behind the scenes on those profiles that we built. We also worked with Jonathan Myson and Alexis Egerman, the writers who basically took our story and brought it to life. And then we worked with a guy called Matty Jordan, who is kind of our Antarctica expert, who spent time on Antarctica at a Kiwi research base down there. And Matty really helped us make sure that it felt as authentic as possible with the different roles and studies that the guys were doing down there too. And also just the base life. It's if you go to do a winter over on Antarctica, like if you've still got your appendix, they've got to come out before you go.
I didn't realise that. They said that, and I was like, oh, okay. Because the doctor said, yes, I had it out because it's hard to operate on yourself, so I just whipped it out. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can basically no risks like that need to be on base, But yeah, I did. Outside of that, just digging into the various characters and their studies, I didn't know how important krill were to our ecosystem.
Fungus as well.
Yeah.
It was fascinating. It was they played the part so well. It was just amazing. It was really interesting along the way.
That's what we think's really, we're really proud of it. Obviously, the format's one thing, but the story and the setting, it allowed us to go really deep into an interesting world that we didn't really know much about to begin with. And for the listener, then it's like I'm not just playing along and being entertained, but it feels more immersive because it's a world that not everyone knows, right?
Exactly. And you need to pay attention. It can't be one of these ones where you're just, I'm just doing the Hoover and I'm just in the back. You need, because every little, I've picked up on a few, I've made a note of it, I won't say anything, but a few little things I was like, I wonder was that a little, how you just put in a little trope every now and again, you're like, was that a red herring or was that? So I've made loads of notes. I'm already starting to stack up to see who I think because they said that. So you've got to really listen.
Yeah, it's not a passive experience, It's a good one for, your summer holiday when you can get through a load of it and focus on it or by the pool maybe.
That would be amazing. I just have to ask you something. Did you play any parts? Did you play Johan? God, you sounded, because I was sure there was your accent in there now and again, and you just disguised it. It was perfect. I was like, God, he's good at that accent, because I know how thick your accent was.
No, at one point I was going to play a certain role in there. I think I was a solicitor, but the team vetoed that. So we have multitasked throughout. There are a couple of free turners who have performed in there, but you'll have to have a listen and have another guess.
Okay then. I'll have a go. But no, I was sure that was you. And the more I listened, I was like, yeah, definitely. But it was just I really, really enjoy it. I hope, people go and listen. Can you tell them more about it? How do they, you can sign up and you can get all the episodes. Tell us that.
Yeah, amazing. So you can listen for free wherever you get your podcasts right now. So the episodes ultimately drop weekly up until mid-August. I think it's the 15th of August. That's when 83 files will be out there for the whole world to listen to. And that's everything bar the final reveal file, right? So it's everything you need to do your investigation. But obviously, if you're hungry to crack the case, you can head to coldtapes.com right now, pay £5 to access all the files immediately and ad-free. And then that £5 as well gives you the ability to select who you think the killer is and enter the prize draw. So the final reveal drops everywhere on the 9th of September. Competition closes on the 6th. And if you've got it right, you'll be in the draw to win that 10 grand. And the winner will receive the Super Sleuth of the Year award at CrimeCon London later in September as well.
I love that. That was a good touch.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want that recognition?
So exactly, it's not just money. It's like, that's a big title up for grabs there.
Yeah. How long did it take for them to do that script? Because it's so in-depth and so many episodes. How?
Yeah, so that process, so we started developing the story in depth probably May last year. In March, April, we were like, Antarctica could be the setting for this, and we got into that, and then the team helped develop the story, and we built out all of the different characters, and we mapped how each character was connected to the other. And so when you talked earlier about, is that a red herring? What's that related to? That's all been carefully thought through, and we did that for every character across the story up until probably it was August last year. And then we brought on Jonathan and Alexis, who wrote concurrently from September every week. They were writing different scripts, but the same characters. And then that's where we were really working with Lyndon and the team to ensure that the investigation was authentic as possible. And Jonathan and Alexis worked right the way through up until probably end of January this year. And then we recorded it at the end of February, and it was wrapped come April. Yeah, it was crazy. It was like last minute. We knew we wanted to get out on the 15th of April. And Sean, who's our lead audio producer, she was brilliant. And me and her were literally up till, I think, 1 a.m. in the morning that day, making sure that the final files were completed. So it was an intense period of work, but like I say, it was all worth it. And hopefully, just thanks so much for having me on talking about it, because I'm sure that when people hear about it and get stuck in, they'll love it as much as you do and we do,
Definitely. Well, I hope they will. They should do, because it's a brilliant podcast. I love it. I can't wait to keep going to see if my theories are right. I'll not tell you. I'll tell you after we finish recording. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure speaking to you again.
Nice one, Dawn. Pleasure's always, yeah. Thank you.
Scottish Murders is a production of Courtroom.